Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second summer talk, Paper, Paint and Leather, Post-War Jewish Businesses on the Treforest Industrial Estate. Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful sunny day. My name's Laura Harrison, and I'm the Oral History Officer for the Jewish History Association of South Wales. This talk is being recorded, so it will be viewable from our website in the coming weeks. And if I can kindly ask you if you'd be able to keep your cameras turned off and your microphones muted while we carry out the talk, because it will help us with the streaming quality. Okay, so this series of summer talks is to highlight the important work we've been carrying out, preserving the Jewish history of South Wales through our oral history interviews. We're currently fundraising for our project To Shout to a Whisper, where we plan to record over 70 oral histories from October this year, but we need your help. I want to thank all of those here today who've already contributed, but the charity sector has really been struggling during COVID, and it's harder than ever to secure the grants we need for our work. So if you enjoy our talk today and would like to support us, Rob's going to put a link to our crowdfunder page in the chat box, and it's also available on our website at www.jhasw.com. So this morning we'll be talking to three gentlemen who were involved in businesses on the Treforest Industrial Estate. Our first speaker is Bob Gregory, who will be giving us a historical overview of the establishment of the estate in the 1930s and some information on the range of Jewish businesses which were trading there, including his family's glove factory.
Do you want it louder?
George Schoenmann will be speaking second about his father's business, General Paper and Box, and going on to establish his own electrical spare parts company. And our third speaker is Michael Pruchnie, who will be telling us about pearl paints and his memories of the estate. So if you have any questions at all for our speakers, we're going to have a 10-minute question and answer session at the end. So please write any questions in the chat box, and I'll be keeping a note of them as we go through to ask at the end. So I'm going to hand over to Bob. Over to you, Bob.
To me?
Yeah, to you.
Okay. Okay, well, let me say straight away that I've got very little or no input as to what transpired on the Treforest trading estate post-war.
What's happened to him now?
I was muted for some reason. You can hear me okay now. I can only talk of my memories of the influx of continental refugees into the new and relatively empty units in the Treforest trading estate in 1939, 1939, and then these refugee enterprises were put onto essential war works in 1940. So I can chat a little bit, if you want me to, about memories of 1938, but post-45 I have to demur to Michael and to George, because I wasn't really involved in anything to do with the Treforest estate post-1945. So
I think it'd be really interesting for us to have a history of how the estate was established. So that would be really nice information. Thank you.
Okay, well, I can talk a little bit on that. So I think this is really going to be the full extent of my input, namely that with the relative demise of the coal mining industry in the Rhondda valleys, where so much of the area was solely dependent for income on the collieries, South Wales became a hub of unemployment, and it was obviously causing the government in the second half of the 30s a great deal of concern. So the then ministries decided to build a raft of new units on what was virgin land in the south of Pontypridd, what became the Treforest trading estate. And in 36, these units were constructed, and a lot of them were with the intention of soaking up the unemployment in the Rhondda valleys north of the area. So anyway, we come to 38, and the activities of the Nazis in Germany and Austria, and many Jewish families, my father included, recognized the writing on the wall, particularly after the infamous Kristallnacht in Germany, and decided to leave their lives and their homes and their enterprises, some larger, some smaller, and pack suitcases and leave while they could to whatever countries were prepared to grant them visas. So I'll talk a little bit about memories of our own situation. My father, my mother, myself, because I was an only child. My parents were Viennese. In 1938, I was 3 years old. Obviously, I have no memories of Vienna, when my father prevailed on my mother to leave Vienna with a couple of suitcases and abandon their homes and abandon their friends and their way of life. And in our case, my parents left Vienna for Brussels. And we were apparently 6 months in Brussels, during which time my father made a couple of visits over to the UK and eventually succeeded in obtaining visas for the family to be accepted in the UK. So we left Brussels in 38. My first memory is of London. We apparently were in a flat in Hendon. I don't know how the flat was paid for because my parents had practically no money. I think my father had managed to get £300, which is equivalent to what? 5,000, 7,000 pounds nowadays, over to Barclays Bank in East Castle Street in London. And so they came to Britain and they had this flat in Hendon, and my first memory. And a little cameo from that memory is my sitting on an empty tea chest in the back garden in Hendon. I don't know who funded the flat or how they found the flat. And there was I sitting on a tea chest, and we had a tin of baked beans, Heinz baked beans, and the parents said, eat the baked beans, but keep the tomato juice back to serve as a drink after eating the beans. And that's my first memory. So that's the background. We're in London. And how does that interface with the Treforest estate? Okay, so my father is instructed by the then Ministry of Supply to move down to Cardiff with a view to taking one of the units in the still relatively virginal Treforest trading estate and starting an enterprise. Now, my father had been a relatively small-time glove manufacturer in Vienna, so that was his expertise, that was his knowledge. He was told to come down to Treforest, move into one of these units, start a glove factory with a view to taking a load of these girls, youngsters from Pontypridd and areas north and start a glove factory, 1938. I don't know, unfortunately, where the money came from, by way of a grant, by way of a loan, I've no idea. So there's my father, unable to speak a word of English, in a new unit, and how he recruits these girls and how he trains them to be sewing machinists without being able to speak the language. I really have no idea. But so that was an outline of our experiences, and mirroring our own families' experiences. There were so many other Austrians and Czechs and Germans and Hungarians who were admitted to the UK in those pre-war days, who likewise spoke English to a greater or lesser extent, or not at all, and they were plonked in another unit and another unit, and because they were entrepreneurial and hardworking and imaginative, the language somehow proved no barrier, and these people started their pre-war enterprises. And I have memories of, I'm going to read a list, but I think George is going to be much more succinct and detailed on this. What we had was our own glove factory, which was named Burlington Gloves. Why Burlington? I think because the Burlington Arcade in London was deemed to be a very high-class place. So the name Burlington had a good ring to it. So our enterprise became Burlington Gloves. Also on the estate in 38, there were two brothers, Österreicher, and the one brother kept his name Österreicher. The other brother decided he was going to change Österreicher to Owen. So there were the brothers Österreicher and Owen, and they opened up as leather tanners, and that became Treforest Chrome Leather. There was a company called Liner who took animal. Am I waffling too much, or is this interesting? No, shall I keep going with this?
No, that's fine, but we've you probably have just a couple of minutes left before we need to hand over to George, just in case people need to leave at 12, that's all.
Let me just run through this list quickly. There was Liner, who took animal bones to make glue, and the smell from that factory was horrendous, and it pervaded the whole estate with this horrible smell. Then there was a man called Wilhelm, who opened a company called Wilpack, maybe a competitor of George's father, I don't know. There were Pearl Paints. Michael will talk more about that. Willie Stern, I remember, very orthodox and observant Jew. There was a company called General Musical Strings, a man called Freddie Stein, a larger company called Aero Zip. I remember the name Andy Koppel, and I've noticed one Koppel name listening in this morning. There was George's father, which became Rizzler. He'll talk about that. There was a man called Carol Bergman, who became a fabric knitter in a company called Bury Son and Company. And there was another fabric knitter called Stuart Singleham, So these were all Jewish families that started their enterprises one way or another. And I think and there were a lot of other companies off the Treforest trading estate that I could talk on, but I think I've talked enough for now.
Thank you, Bob. It's a shame to cut you short when you have so much information, but because we've got the three speakers, maybe we can take some more of your memories later in the question and answer session. So that would be nice. So now I'm going to hand over to George. I think you've got a PowerPoint presentation for us.
Yes, ready to go.
Excellent. Take it away, George.
I'll share the screen. There we go. Right, we're in. So my talk today, I'm going to talk about General Paper and Box Manufacturing Company Limited, which probably the name is not known to most of you because eventually it became Rizzler, and that all happened well after the war. But first of all, I want to speak mainly about my own family situation. Like Bob's family, we were in Vienna, but we were not quite as lucky as he was, because we were not allowed to leave until April 1939, which was really quite close to the start of the war. But my father saw what was happening, and again, like Bob's father, in 1938, he realized that there was no future anymore for us in Vienna. So he took steps to set up a company in South Wales, well, at least in Britain. He was put in touch with Mr. Wilhelm, who Bob correctly stated became Wilpack. But in fact, Mr. Wilhelm and my father were partners, and they set up the original company of General Paper and Box. So my father organized it all from Vienna before he left. He found sources for the machinery and the equipment, and arranged for it all to be set up in a factory on the Treforest estate, up to which they'd obtained the lease. It's interesting again to refer back to Bob. The factory was situated, I think, next door to Pearl Paints, which is the company that Michael's going to talk about. Next door, the other way, was Liners, who were the infamous glue factory. And I think Treforest Chrome Leather was the next factory on down the road again. And then looking the other way, we had Aerosmith, was a next door neighbor. So although I was very young, I was only 5 or 6 at the time, I did know quite a lot of people. One interesting thing to talk about is why the company was set up in South Wales. Well, Bob has dwelt on it. It was because of the high unemployment, and really the Jews, if they wanted to set up a company, were not given much option of where to go. Now, most of them would no doubt have preferred to have set up in London or Birmingham or Manchester, but no, the options were South Wales, I think the south of Scotland and Cumberland or somewhere. And I think most of them considered that the least worst option was South Wales. At least Cardiff was a reasonably big city and had a good link to London. As far as General Paper and Box were concerned, they needed more money. So 2 new directors were appointed, a Mr. Farlow and a Mr. Aronson, who were both from London. They were purely financiers, and they provided enough capital. Later on, I think late in 1939, Mr. Toffler joined the company as well, because he came from Prague and managed to get his money out of Czechoslovakia, and so could bring quite a lot of extra capital. Production started at the end of 1939. So that was the plaque. And I must point out that all these photographs are from an album which my father left me, and really is what I've based all my knowledge of the company on. Although I was fortunate that every Saturday morning, as a small boy, he would take me in with him and I would go out and play in the factory, which was the highlight of my week. That's the factory in its camouflage state. I think it's quite interesting that none of the factories on the Treforest estate were actually bombed. So most of the German bombers concentrated on the Cardiff Docks area, and they just weren't aware of what was going on the estate. So the camouflage must have been effective. That's a picture of Mr. Wilhelm, who's my father's partner. The boxes that he made, you can see on the desk. They weren't very sophisticated. They were straightforward flat pieces of cardboard with the edges bent over. And in some cases, they were covered with paper. That's my father, unfortunately, with his cigarette, which he was really never without. And it killed him in the end because he died at the young age of 68. And proper smoking related disease, which was heart trouble. That's a picture of Mr. Toffler, who was a lifelong friend of my father. And in fact, after he was forced to leave Risda, he and Mr. Toffler went into business together and made furniture. That's what we made. There were four main brands. The one that stands out is the orange one, which is Rizzler. And Big Ben was a brand that they sold independently in Britain. And then the other two, or the one on the left, Conquistador, was to their main customer in Portugal, which my father brought with him from his company in Vienna. And I think the other one was which they sold in the colonies, mainly in the African countries. That's a picture inside the factory. That's the gumming machine, which is the start of the process. The cigarette paper comes in big rolls. Gum is applied at one end. It goes round the drum, which is heated to dry it, and then it's slitted into bobbins. I'm rushing through these because I realize time is of the essence. That's another view of the machine. And would you believe it, yet another view. And on the left, you can see the glass containers for the gum Arabic, which is what you lick to make the cigarette. That's how the bobbins were stored. They had to be stored in a relatively cold, damp atmosphere so that the paper absorbs some moisture so that it can be folded and packed. That's the machine that made the booklets. It starts off with a roll of orange paper at one end, which then goes through the various processes. All the printing is stamped on, and the unit right at the right-hand end is where the shape is cut out, and then they come out as the booklets. That's another view of the machine from the other end. You know, judging by all these pictures, I think my father was a real enthusiast for machinery, which is something that I've inherited from him. So I'm sorry if some of you might be bored with all these machinery pictures. That's the folding machine where the papers are interleaved so that when you pull one out, the other one follows, which is quite clever. They had a whole army of girls sitting at these machines, putting the rolls on one end and taking off the folded pieces and putting them into those frames. They then moved on to a packing department, where they were hand packed into the booklets to do small runs, which the machinery that they had couldn't really cope with. I noticed the man in charge in his dinner suit. He was the manager of the department. And from what I know of him, he always came dressed like that. They had high standards in those days, or possibly that was the only suit he had. I don't know. More views of the girls. This is the machine which, for long runs, they put in the cigarette cartons on that tube in the middle. The packets are loaded on the tubes by the girl on the left, and then the finished article comes out ready packed and is put into boxes. This was one machine that fascinated me. It was a guillotine, and the chap in charge, whose name I still manage to remember sort of nearly 80 years later, his name was Mr. Phillips. I wonder if any of his relatives are still looking at this. More views of the hand packing. Then finally we come to the packing department, and it's strange that right through the war, with Britain totally isolated, they were still managing to export stuff. As you can see from the boxes, the one is going to Porto, which is to the customer in Lisbon, and the one on the right is going to, well, it's Mombasa. And there's another one for Durban. And that's the final stage when it's loaded onto the lorry. So anyway, to continue the story, in 1942, unfortunately, there were serious upheavals in the company. Mr. Wilhelm had a violent disagreement with my father, unfortunately, although it didn't actually come to physical blows. I remember there was a lot of shouting in the cars when they took me to school in the morning. And anyway, in 1942, Mr. Wilhelm was voted off, and he relocated the box making division as a separate company, which was Wilpack in Ischia. And I think up until fairly recently, the company has been going. And in fact, when I was in business myself, I did actually buy boxes from him. Possible reasons for the dispute, and this is all supposition on my part. The cigarette paper side of the business did a whole lot better than the box side, and in fact provided most of the profits and the income. So Mr. Wilhelm decided to sue my father and remove him from the company, and there was further vexatious litigation. This is a plan of the factory which I found among his documents, and you can see all the left-hand side is the cigarette paper side, and the space that is left blank on the right was where the box making was. So relatively speaking, it shows that the cigarette paper was the dominant part of the business. In 1940, Mr. Wilhelm issued a summons against my father for £90, which he said was the interest on the money which he'd lent him to buy his 10% of the shares. And then in 1942, Mr. Wilhelm lodges a claim against him for the return of the whole sum or the surrendering of his shares. The board of directors then dispensed with Mr. Wilhelm's services, and he decides to take his whole box-making department to a factory in Ischia near Porth. In 1943, Mr. Wilhelm lodges a claim of misfeasance, whatever that is, against the company and its directors. I looked it up, and I think it just means wrongdoing. And I would point out that none of these cases and claims ever came to court, but it just caused my father a lot of unhappiness and worry. In 1947, work commenced on the expansion of the factory. The Treforest Industrial Estate said that if people wanted to build new factories, they would provide the finance and do it. So behind the original factory, they set to and started building a big extension. And this is it being built. This is it in a further stage. You know, the shell of the building is nearly complete, but of course there was a lot of work to be done inside. That's in 1948. That's a picture taken by my father on Kodachrome, which is the finished factory. And that's it from the front. This is quite an interesting picture, which I got from the Rhondda Cynon Taf archives. It shows the 1937 bit was the original factory. The 1947 was the new build bit that my father designed and had built. In 1956, after he left, they built another extension, and then it would appear a small extension in 1959. I think also, just to show what is coming, next door to the factory, shown in faint, that is Pearl Paint's factory, which I think was their next door neighbour. That's a picture taken in the 70s, again from the archives, showing how they tidied it up, and in fact it looked very nice. Then in 1948, Risler took an interest in this company and thought that it was becoming too big for their comfort. So they offered the shareholders a very good price for their shares. Mr. Farlow and Mr. Aronson, who owned at least half of these shares, were keen to accept, and Mr. Toffler agreed to sell too. The only one not keen to sell was my father, but he only had 10%, so obviously he had no say. The deal went through and my father was given the service contract for 5 years. Then in 1951, Risler decided they no longer needed his services and asked him to go. They paid him the 2 years' salary in a lump sum and gave him his company car and wished him goodbye. And I'm sorry to say, he never recovered from this blow. Then moving on many, many years, at some point, Risler is bought by Imperial Tobacco. Then the factory closed in 2005 and all the workers were made redundant. The production was moved to a factory in Belgium, and according to a report in the local paper, that's how I got that information. So that is the end of my story. Thank you very much for listening. And
thank you, George.
I'll now stop sharing.
That was lovely to see the photographs. Yeah, thank you for doing that for us.
Okay.
So it seems very fitting now to pass over to your neighbour, Michael, because he's promised he's going to behave today. We've got no guarantees.
Absolutely.
So, carry on, Michael.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Laura. George and Bob, thanks very much for your introductions. And George, I never knew the history of our next door neighbour. It was fascinating to see. What I'd like to do, because I know that time is most probably limited, I'm going to talk about what was originally the Pearl Varnish Company. The company itself was set up in 1936 in London by one of three brothers, Willie Stern. He was the only one of the family who spoke fluent English because of his trading experience. And the beginnings of the company actually go back to the early 1900s in Fulda in Germany, where they had an agricultural business and a paint making business. And as everybody knows, the two things go side by side. Apparently, when the paint business was quiet, they used to sell the products on the market. And it was quite a successful company with quite a high technical element to the company itself. Essentially, like Bob's family, they saw that things were going to happen in George's family. Willie started boiling hat varnishes in the basement of his house in London. And the reason why it was hat varnishes is that the German company, Full de Lac Fabrique, was actually exporting varnishes to the UK and to Sweden. So basically they took the exports away, and he actually started to use that as to turn the business into a starting basis. He then moved to a small factory in an underground area, and was told by the ministry they had to move to Treforest. He didn't know where it was, so he was also given a choice of going to the northeast of England. So he promptly took his shoelace off and measured the distance from London to Treforest and London to the northeast. And that's basically how the Stearns moved there. The family's factory was acquired by Goering's nephew for a Deutschmark. And so they, by that time, they'd started the process of moving to the UK. The three brothers and their families came over to Cardiff, started to settle into the factory, and their first worker was actually an unemployed miner who turned up one day and started sweeping the floor. And at the end of the day said, "Can I be paid, please?" So they paid him, and he actually, his name was Stan Ellis. He actually became the shop steward of the company. And Willie Stearn then went back to Germany in 1938, bribed officials and brought out other members of the company, the Katz family and some of the others, and also brought them to Cardiff as well. So from my understanding, they were one of the few Orthodox Jewish companies in Treforest. They had a lot of German technology, and regrettably, in my last house move, accidentally I threw away all their original formula books and also their accounts, which were written on the back of cigarette packets, you know, highly sophisticated. Essentially, during the war, they were moved up to Porth to live because they were deemed as aliens. Simon Stearn, the older brother, actually had, in the First World War, won the Iron Cross. So the whole family were moved up. They were then moved back down because one of the products that they made was heat-resistant paints for Merlin, Spitfire Merlin engines. So they became, if you like, a military supplier as well. So our family's connection with Pearl Varnish, which became Pearl Paints, was in the early 1960s when my father joined as a sales manager. And I was dragged forcibly as a young man from the center of civilization in Manchester to the delights of Cardiff. And actually, I've never regretted that move. My father was also a scientist and chemist, and that reinforced Pearl's vision, or the Stearns' vision, of technical excellence. And in fact, throughout that period, from the 1960s through to the 2000s, we had the highest percentage of scientists and chemists in any paint company in the UK, which is quite an achievement. essentially when Dad joined, clients included Corgi Cars, Triang. They also had become the world's second largest suppliers of paint for mirrors. And I can't describe sufficiently how big that business was. It was a major global business, which a small family company developed in competition with some very, very large global manufacturers. Dad became the managing director in the late 60s. By that time, Simon Stern, the older brother, had retired. Fritz Stern wanted to retire, leaving Willie Stern as the chairman of the company. And also Simon's son, Walter, was left as works manager. From the early 70s through to the mid 70s, Pearl as a group doubled in size every year, either by growth that was developed in the UK or by acquisitions. And the first acquisition was ironically a German paint group called Detmolder Lackfabrik Niesen and Zerner. And Dad protected Willie and the others from having to deal with the Germans, but it was if you like, a commercial and a technical logic to acquire them. There were also companies in America and Malta as well. A lot of people in the Jewish community think they knew the business of Pearl, but actually a lot of the things that we did were hidden because our products were used on other people's manufactures. So in other words, we supplied British Aerospace with a flame retardant paint for Concorde, for example. In later years, we were the people who supplied the paint for Sony, Toshiba, Hitachi, and a whole range of television companies. We never publicized it, they were clients. Nobody ever knew. My favorite was we also supplied Chanel, Givenchy, Dior with some of their products around the world. And towards the end of the company's history, we developed a glass coating division. So we were the people behind Malibu White, Bombay Gin Blue. There were a whole range of commercial products that people had no idea were the basis of Pearl. Essentially, the company kept on growing, but as it grew, it was clear that the management structure wasn't good enough to develop an integrated group business. People were good in their own areas. I joined in 1977 as a summer job, and I'm proud to say that my first training was watching paint drying. Can you imagine telling people I'm a qualified paint drying tester? 7 hours it took, but I got through it. Essentially, I was actually doing a master's degree as well. So I worked and studied at the same time, initially working as a general dog's body, because the philosophy of the company, going back to the Stearns time, is you had to serve an apprenticeship. And any family member who came in was publicly humiliated, shouted at, and generally knocked into shape. And the reason for that was that the workers of the company, who were the lifeblood of the company, saw there was no favoritism. And in fact, in later life, when Pearl closed, I continued that approach, to business when I was working and living abroad. So essentially, Pearl grew, but was becoming unmanageable. And my father's old company had been trying to acquire Pearl Group for at least 5 years. And on the 6th year, he spoke to the board of directors and some of the shareholders, and the business was sold. At that time, we also didn't know that my father had the start of cancer, and it was becoming very draining for him. I was too young to take up the mantle, and the other divisional managing directors were just looking after their own businesses. So in the early 1980s, we were acquired by the Donald Macpherson Group, who promptly closed their factory, Porter Paints, in Ferndale, and integrated it into Pearl. And my father became a junior board director for Macpherson. And at the beginning, they weren't too sure what to do with me. They didn't want to leave me in the company because I had a lot of personal loyalty. By that time, I was running all the exports of the business and 3 side divisions. And therefore, it became a major project that a new team was sent in, all from Porter Paints. I was kept on the periphery and then moved to the group. Pearl in Treforest, they kept the name Pearl, developed very quickly. There was significant investment, but all the old people were retired. They didn't fit the new strategy of Macpherson. Dad led Macpherson's developments in 3 areas until he had to retire because of cancer after 3 years. And if you like, his achievement, excuse me, was leading the first major joint development project with the Chinese. And it was incredibly difficult to set up, but very successful. I moved over to the group and took over the running of the group industrial exports, plus a military division, plus a few other things. And essentially, I used to go to Treforest once a week or twice a week, but everybody left me alone. And it was as if I wasn't wearing deodorant because none of the management would talk to me. First of all, they didn't want me to know what was going on. But secondly, they were frightened that if I found out, I could have spoken to my boss, who was the chairman of Macpherson. Cut through 5 years later, Macpherson were acquired by a Finnish group called Tikkurila. And Tikkurila took a knife to the senior management in Macpherson. And in 2 months, about 200 of the senior people were disposed of or fired or whatever. Luckily at the time I was in China, so they didn't get to me because we didn't have mobile phones at that time. And by the time I came back, there were only 5 people of my level still in the company. I worked for the new chairman who one day offered me the chance of buying Pearl back. Either that or leave. So when you've got a choice like that, you think deeply. It took me about 3 seconds. And I said, I'll give it a go. Dad came back. He was in remission. And we decided to have a go at it again. The company was in a terrible state. A lot of the business had been stripped out. The buildings were in bad condition. And morale was extremely low. We negotiated. The workforce didn't want to work for us. They wanted redundancy. And essentially, we were one of the first people in the UK to get a life policy for the company, and the beneficiaries were the workforce. And that was the only way we could settle them down. That was valid for 5 years. We rebuilt the business back, but some of the products were excluded. So we had to bring in new ones. So we acquired the business of BASF Building Products in the UK. Dexter Wood Coatings was acquired, and there were a couple of other small businesses. And slowly we rebuilt the business, but by this time added television coatings, bottle coatings, and some other specialty areas. And we went out on a recruitment drive to bring in leading experts to drive the business forward. There were good years, there were bad years, and generally we plowed back any profit in the company to keep on our investment. In the mid 1900s, Bill Pollock, another businessman from Cardiff, from Apollo Leather, joined the board and became a shareholder. And that added strength and vision. And we continued growing up until the time my father sadly passed away. And we'd gone for 13 years. Business was becoming difficult. It was becoming very complex. And in the paint industry, we were being hit by environmental issues as well. The business settled down after the shock of my father passing away. Our clients were fabulous. The industry was fabulous until we worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until one worker mixed 2 chemicals in the wrong percentages. And essentially there was an explosion. It burnt for about 8 hours. Maximum temperature reached inside the factory was 900 degrees C. And if you can imagine, we had solvents, nitrocellulose, gun cotton, everything there, and we weren't allowed to move it away. The fire was put out by our sprinklers, and essentially we were back in business in 3 days. But then we were hit by the Environment Agency for various things. And the whole incident, I think, took the heart out of the company and the workforce. We had some problems with some of the directors, and basically we decided to call in the administrators who came in, closed the factory, and then persuaded Bill and I, against my better judgment, to rebuy the business and start again. So we were backed by a GE corporate finance, went away again, developed more businesses, but still had the after effect of the environmental issues within the company. There was, excuse me, there was an incident a few years later where, I'm not going to go into it, but I was in a country where, for various reasons, there was an argument, and I was threatened physically and actually by having a gun put to my head. When you, and it's a complex thing, I'm not going to explain it, but getting over that problem, and it was caused by 500 £5,000 worth of mystical paint problems that never were never in reality. I flew back to the UK, we resolved the matter, to find the factory had gone out on strike for the first time since 1936 because of the action of the directors. And Bill and I made the decision that that was it. We would close the company for the final time. The administrators were called in. 50% of the business was sold to American group, 50% was sold to a British group. As far as I'm aware, the majority, if not all the workers, found new jobs quickly. The pension fund was secured. I was the only person who didn't work for 6 months, excuse me. And then I went out to work in Russia for 18 years in different positions in the paint industry, oil and gas. The factory is still standing today. The memories are still strong, particularly with my mother. What I will never forget is the loyalty of the workforce, who throughout that time that I was there showed tremendous support, apart from when they wanted to be made redundant by Macpherson. I suppose I would have done the same. And it was a hard time, but industry changes over a period. And if you ask me now, would we have ever survived that and come back and grow? The paint industry has changed significantly. And
sorry, Michael, I'm just going to have to.
There you go.
Because we're running a bit over time now, and I'm just aware in case people have to head off.
My apologies, but
that's okay. It was
I was well behaved.
You were very well behaved.
I know,
yeah, that was
surprising.
Really interesting information, and it is nice to know that Pearl Paints came back home to you after going away for a bit. So
yes,
yeah, definitely,
absolutely.
So people are quite welcome to stay. We'll have a quick couple of questions that we had in the chat if they want to. And also Rob has put up the link to our crowdfunder. So if you enjoyed our talk today, we'd really appreciate any of your donations. Thank you so much. And I think I had 2 questions that came in for George, asking if the Schoenmanns brought their skills with them from Vienna, and also to describe the noise level in your factory.
Yes, well, they certainly brought their skills with them, because my father had exactly the same factory in Vienna. And I have a series of pictures which shows the same machinery. Everything is exactly the same as it was in Vienna. And really, without him, there would have been no General Paper and Box, because he's the one who knew how cigarette papers were made. As for the noise level, well, the machines did make a horrendous clatter, and you certainly couldn't hear yourself speak or think.
I noticed from a lot of the images, the large amount of the workforce were women. Was that due to the wartime issues of the men being away, or did it carry on with women afterwards?
Well, I don't want to be sexist or anything, but
I'm putting you in a dangerous position now.
But women were really suited much better to the sort of work that they were doing. And the men were there mainly to do the heavy lifting and to operate the machinery and the tool room. But loading the machinery was really done better by the women. Sorry, I'm being plagued by a cat here. Yeah.
Can I ask as well about the impact that your Jewish faith had on the businesses? Because I know, Michael, you were saying that Pearl Paints was originally very Orthodox Jewish owners.
That's
so
right.
How did that impact the running?
It was really the Sterns managed the company in the way that they practiced Orthodoxy Judaism. In the simplest terms, they had their own canteen and nobody was allowed to disturb them. And there were about 8 members of the Orthodox Jewish community at one time working there. They closed early on a Friday afternoon in the winter, and they did keep all the Jewish holidays. My father was the rogue because he would actually eat with them sometimes, but most of the time he'd go, he'd actually go to the pie shop and buy a pasty or sausage roll and then eat it as he was walking around so he wouldn't upset the Sterns. But they had a very, very high moral value, particularly Simon, who was very much the production man. Willie, exactly the same.
We just had a question in from Gillian asking if Menachem Stern, as an engineer, ever worked in the company.
It's possible. I don't remember the name. My mother might, but there were other members of the Stern family working there before my father joined in the 60s. So that's possible, yes.
Well, thank you ever so much for speaking for us today. I've learned so much about the estate I didn't know before. And it's been really nice seeing in the chat as well, all the different people that have history and memories of the estate too. So thank you all for joining us. Apologies, we ran over by a couple of minutes, but I hope you all have a lovely day and take care, and we'll see you all soon for our next talk at the end of July. Bye, everyone.